Social media is filled with various reports of trouble at voting locations as we face an era of misinformation.
You can see the woman trying to select Donald Trump. She repeatedly clicks, and at one point it even selects Kamala Harris.
Recent incidents across the country have election officials on high alert after several ballot boxes were actually set on fire.
This is probably the most fraudulent election that anyone's ever seen.
The claims have undermined public confidence in elections and in the people who oversee them.
With the election, the internet has exploded with conspiracy theories, rumors, memes of voter fraud, hacking voting machines, immigrants being flown in to vote, whether or not you need an ID to vote, and foreign state interference, just to name a few. And so we wanted to talk to the premier nonpartisan election expert, David Becker, because I have questions about all of this stuff and want some answers about exactly how worried we should be about the integrity of our elections, because we believe that you deserve this information.
If we live in a country where a majority of both parties don't believe they can ever lose and refuse to accept defeat, we're doomed.
And David has some brilliant things to say about why everyone should calm down and go vote. Election is going to be contentious, and we know it's going to be contentious before it even happens. So we have David Becker here, who's an expert on all things electoral. He's the executive director and founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, which is a nonpartisan, non-political group that helps with election officials on both parties around the country ensure election integrity, something we all love. He was the director of the elections program at the Pew Charitable Trusts and a former civil rights attorney in the voting section of the Department of Justice. David Becker, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Shane. It's great to be with you.
I was just saying, I don't know if we're going to get this out in time for the election or not, but we want to keep the channel open because no matter what happens and no matter who wins, there is going to be controversy.
Right.
So, yeah.
I was just going to say, and how sad is it that we know that regardless of how well the election is run, regardless of how many voters take part and have their voice expressed, that based on what we've seen recently in 2020 and afterwards, that it's likely that candidates who are losing or think they're losing are going to spread disinformation about that process and try to undermine our faith in democracy when, in fact, and I know we'll get to this, and the reality is our elections are more secure and verifiable, have more integrity than they've ever had in American history.
Well, this is what I want to get to because there's a lot to unpack today.
Yeah.
And I kind of want to go back because you're an expert. I want to do a sort of primer. I want to do a historical look at things, or at least go back, let's say, 20 years, because a lot of this is modern. And, to go back to that question you just brought up is, if you can never lose, then why wouldn't you use that card? If it was stolen from me, I didn't lose. I'm not a loser. It was stolen by the deep state. It was stolen by Russia. It was stolen by the Free Syrian Army, which I don't want to cut to the end. But let's start with some contemporary news, which I never do, but I'm going to because I'm so excited about this bloody interview. Foreign intelligence, U.S. intelligence, confirmed a couple days ago that Russia was behind the fake video of mail-in ballots being destroyed in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Now, this is sort of states against counties. You have to win counties in America to win the election, and states like Russia, like the Free Syrian Army, like North Korea, like China, like Iran, have all stated publicly that they want to mess with us and mess with our elections. So this just broke recently that Russia is spreading already disinformation and misinformation about ballots being destroyed in Bucks County. What can you tell us about that?
Well, first of all, we should say this isn't just recently or a new development. Russia and also to some degree China and Iran have been trying to interfere in our elections for quite some time, at least since 2016 and maybe even earlier, leveraging social media and other technologies. In 2016, an arm of the Russian GRU tried to infiltrate the Illinois voter registration database in July. They sat there for some time and didn't really do anything. They didn't change anything. They didn't make, they didn't delete anything. And then a few weeks later, they basically just ramped up and accessed a whole bunch of files, which was immediately detected.
Right.
And the question I got then was, why did Russia do that if they were undetected prior? And the answer clearly is they wanted to be detected. They actually can't infiltrate our cybersecurity infrastructure, our election infrastructure. Our machines aren't connected to the internet. We have paper ballots. 97% of all voters are going to vote on paper ballots, which we can audit and recount, confirm that the machine counts were all right. But what they can do is hack into our minds and try to make us disbelieve and delegitimize our own elections. And imagine, these are autocracies. These are dictators who have tried for decades. Think about the Soviet Union and how they tried to delegitimize American democracy, get us to disbelieve it, how the Chinese Communist Party have tried to do that. And they largely failed until recently they found domestic actors who are willing to do their work for them and help amplify lies about our processes. So what we're seeing now with this Bucks County video, we're going to see a lot more of it. Voters should expect, regardless of who you support, you're going to be targeted for disinformation. It's going to be disinformation that kind of reinforces pre-existing beliefs about the other side, and it's happening so that you will get angry and possibly violent, and importantly, donating. And just be very aware of that, particularly of information that you see that seems to validate whatever your beliefs are, because we're going to be inundated with it over the next several weeks.
Whenever I put up my hand, it just means I don't want to interrupt you, but I have a further point. So you say, yes, Shane, yeah. And then I go.
Yes, Shane, go for it.
Okay, so I love all of this. I'm already terrified, and we're not even 4 minutes in. I'm
going to have some things that make you feel less terrified later.
Good.
Start with the terrifying, because I'm largely optimistic about everything.
So speaking of information, disinformation, hackability, non-hackability, what you're saying there is both terrifying and somewhat comforting in that we know that nation-state actors or malignant actors are trying to spread disinformation and misinformation, yet you're saying that the voting machines themselves are secure. Now, I want to get into that in a bigger way, but I want to because it's in the news and because it's a big, I guess, exemplification of what we're talking about today is the Fox News Dominion lawsuit, which sort of deals with a lot of this stuff. Now, if you could unpack what that lawsuit was about, because I know a lot of people know about it, but don't know the particulars. So what was that lawsuit about, and why did it have such large ramifications?
Well, so what the lawsuit was about was that people associated with the Trump campaign, and we all remember the Rudy Giuliani hair dye dripping down the side of his face press conference at the RNC in November. We're spreading a lot of completely fabricated lies about the voting machines, the voting machine companies, about systems that basically had paper ballots and were verified. Georgia literally counted every single one of its presidential ballots 3 different times, 3 different ways, once entirely by hand. And Fox News was alleged to have basically facilitated that, basically looking for opportunities to spread lies about this. They made statements that appeared to be factual. They were complete lies about Dominion as alleged in their lawsuit. And that case was on the eve of trial. The Dominion voting system company filed a massive defamation lawsuit. And rather than go to trial and take their chances with a jury, both on liability and damages, it tells you so much that Fox News on the eve of trial said they'd rather pay nearly $800 million. I believe it's one of the top 2 or 3 defamation settlements in American history to this voting system company, rather than have to put up evidence that suggests that they didn't lie about that or didn't facilitate and broadcast lies on that. And we've seen similar things when it came to defamation cases against Rudy Giuliani himself, brought by 2 poll workers in Georgia, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, where he conceded liability rather than prove that what he was saying was true, and now has a nearly $150 million judgment against him, and his apartment in New York and other properties are being seized, and same with Carrie Lake in a defamation case there.
So basically, they're claiming, that the election, that they hacked the Dominion voting machines.
Well, let's be clear here. They don't like the outcome, so they're throwing everything they can. They were throwing everything they can at the outcome in 2020.
The outcome of the election.
The outcome of the election, yeah. It was the machines. It was mail ballot fraud. It was truckloads of fake ballots.
Yeah.
It was a stopping and starting of the count. It was bamboo ballots. It was dead Venezuelan dictators. It was Italian satellites and German servers. And if you haven't heard all of these crazy conspiracy theories, I've literally not made any of those up.
Right.
Those are actual claims made by Trump and his allies in the aftermath of the election. And none of them had any basis because our system is verifiable. And over 60 courts heard claims. And when you go, you can say whatever you want on social media or even on Fox News or other networks. But when you go to court, you're going to be expected to bring evidence. Yeah. And as we sit here today, we're almost 48 months since that election. There's still not been one single shred of evidence presented to any court anywhere in the country that suggests the outcome is in any question at all.
So that's interesting because you have one side of the government calling it into question still 4 years later. So we're already in the new electoral cycle. We're nearly finished the new electoral cycle, and we're still calling into question the last election. Why? Because we don't want to lose. Now, let's get into...
And Shane, if I can, can I say something real quick? Because you raised a point that I think is really important. These same paper ballots, some of the people who are raising objections and claims about the elections, they were elected on the same paper ballots, counted by the same machines.
Sure.
Whether it was Dominion machines or whatever. The members of the House in January of 2021 in Arizona who complained about Arizona's elections and the election of Joe Biden there, they were elected on those same ballots, literally 1 or 2 lines below the presidential race.
Yeah.
That's true in Pennsylvania and many other states. This is one of the things that just makes this conspiracy theory both in some ways laughable, but also really disturbing that it's caught on so much.
Yeah, and if I get elected, then it's real. But if they get elected, then it's not. So I want to get into some. You mentioned conspiracy theories, of which there's a lot. I want to go back to voting machines, but you brought up a bunch of the sort of I don't want to call them memes, but memes or cultural givens or whatever. Now the big one that we hear a lot about is non-citizens voting, dead people voting, voting twice, voter ID. Now, the voter ID is sort of taken on huge, social media around where you have to have ID to fly, you have to have ID to buy booze, you have to have ID for this, but you don't have to have ID to vote. Maybe we can get into that. Non-citizens voting, that's become a massive thing of we're just having an open border, which we're doing an immigration special, which we don't have an open border. But, the theory is, and this is a widespread accepted theory, that, we're letting in unlimited amounts of immigrants to come in that we will then convert to voters who will then vote Democratic. I'm an immigrant, and I vote, and I became a citizen, and I can tell you that the process is incredibly difficult, but this is a given now. It's a given that we're letting.
And you wouldn't have risked that process by registering to vote or voting illegally while you were in the midst of that process illegally, because you would have gotten deported, Shane.
Yeah.
You would have risked your presence here in the United States, which you had worked so hard for, be deported. It's one of the reasons we know this happens.
Voting for a city councilor is not enough to get me kicked out and back to my country and possibly go to jail for fraud. But let's get into that. Non-citizens voting, dead people voting, voter ID, all of this stuff we see kind of in every election, but now in this one it's become a particularly hot topic. What the hell is going on?
So listen, this is all because, remember, so we have more voter ID. We have less non-citizen voting. By the way, it's virtually zero anyway, but it was really close. And more paper ballots and more audits of the ballots and voting machines than we did in 2016.
Right.
But we didn't hear these people complain in 2016 because they like the outcome.
Sure.
This is all driven by people who cannot accept defeat and then grift upon their supporters who desperately want to believe that they weren't, that their candidate wasn't defeated, which I understand, being sincerely disappointed election.
Yeah.
I mean, is there anything more American than being disappointed in the outcome of an election? But so let's go into some of the specifics.
Yes.
First of all, voter ID. Every single voter who registers in the United States for federal elections has to show ID. We have voter ID for voter registration. Every single voter under the Help America Vote Act of 2002 for over 2 decades has had to give a driver's license number or a social security number, which gets matched to the database to confirm identity and confirm their relevant status. That's true throughout the United States and has been for over 2 decades. Second, the vast majority of states have voter ID, whether you like it or not. Georgia has voter ID. Michigan has voter ID. Arizona has voter ID. I mean, we can go down the list. North Carolina has voter ID. I mean, these are states that have voter ID. Why? You can complain about voter ID, but that doesn't explain Georgia.
Right.
And it doesn't explain Michigan, because voter ID is required both to register as it is nationwide and to get and cast your ballot in those states.
And why wouldn't you have voter ID for everybody?
So there is pretty good evidence that there are some people in this country who have a hard time getting ID because they lack the documentation. They may be older. There are people who live on tribal lands. There are people who've had their documents wiped out by things like hurricanes. There are some people. It's a small number, and I think what election officials are trying to do is find that balance between integrity and access. Right? If you ask election officials around this country, both parties, they will tell you their goal is to have all eligible voters voting and only eligible voters voting, right? They want to do both, and most things work in that way to allow for both. We don't take a position on voter ID. I'm just saying factually where it exists. But every single voter, whether you have to show a plastic card or do it through some other means, has to verify their identity before they get a ballot. That's true everywhere. I don't care where you live. If you're in California, you're going to find that they're going to ask you who you are. They're going to ask you where you live. They're going to ask you maybe for your birth date when you show up. They're going to ask for information that confirms your identity. And by the way, if someone comes in and impersonates you, they've just committed the dumbest crime that you can possibly imagine.
Yeah.
They've got a long documentary trail. They've given their face to eyewitnesses. Yeah. And if you show up to vote, they'll know. They'll flag like, "Oh my God, this guy really voted." So they'll know.
But it obviously a lot of people talk about it when it. So it does happen, and how does it happen, and why does it happen? I mean, we hear about it every election that there's voter fraud and there's illegal ballots.
Voter impersonation fraud doesn't really happen. Like I said, it's the dumbest crime imaginable to go in and impersonate someone and vote in person. It's very, very rare that someone might take a mail ballot from someone else and vote that. But 2 things are going to happen. One, it's very likely that ballot's going to be rejected because of a failed signature match. And secondly, it's almost a near certainty that the real voter is going to try to vote. And when the real voter tries to vote, they will flag that, and they will have a documentary trail of a piece of paper in an envelope that you have written on, that you have touched, that indicates fraud. Like I said, there's so many of these checks and balances in place. It's one of the reasons it's so rare. If you want to get free room and board courtesy of the United States Bureau of Prisons or your state prison system, commit voter fraud. It's not the crime of the century.
How often does it happen?
So it's hard to find definite stats on this, but the stats that we have indicate, look, even the Heritage Foundation, which has been trying to push this myth of widespread voter fraud for decades, they have a database that goes back to 1980 of alleged voter fraud. And the total number of cases that they found that are allegedly voter fraud, this is just possible, is about 1,000. And that is literally out of literally tens of billions of ballots cast.
Yeah.
And this is the foundation that has the highest incentive to make those numbers as high as possible. Election officials will tell you they investigate it after every election. They have tools to do this. The amount of voter fraud we would expect to see nationwide in this election is probably in the dozens of votes, nowhere close to the thousands of votes.
So it's de minimis. Now, are there weak spots in our voting system?
Our voting system is pretty good. I mean, look, Louisiana doesn't have paper ballots. Some counties in Texas don't have paper ballots. That needs to be refined. We're always improving the audits to make them even better so that we can confirm that the machine's counted right.
Sorry, because paper ballots are harder to hack? Is that why?
Well, because paper ballots, because we have a secret ballot in the United States. And thank you for asking that, because sometimes I go right to the, assuming some of the information. So because we have a secret ballot in the United States, I can't go back to you, Shane, and say, hey, we're just confirming that the election was right. Will you tell us how you voted? I want to make sure that your paper ballot reflects that. So the paper ballot is important because that is the artifact that the voter themselves have looked at, have confirmed before putting it into the machine, into the ballot box. And then if we go back and count that, we'll know that every voter looked at that and confirmed that. So it's our way of knowing that the voter's intent is captured for the foreseeable future, and we can go back and confirm it over and over and over again, which you can't do with purely digital ballots. You want to do that with paper. It's one of the reasons it's a very good thing that we've got paper ballots nationwide. We've got to get 100%. We're very, very close, certainly in the battleground states. We're always improving audits. I think we can improve our voter registration systems a little bit, allow for a little more interactivity. One of the hardest things to do in elections is to keep up with the mobility of the American voter. Americans move a lot. And many states belong to a consortium called the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC for short, which I helped create, which they run and allows them to share data to tell them, oh, one of your voters just got a driver's license in this other state. So you can contact them and see if they moved, so you can remove them from your list.
Right.
That wasn't available before. But even that has been the subject of conspiracy theories. Even, extremists on the right have basically pressured some of the Republican states to leave that, which actually hurts their election integrity. So there are some things we can do to improve it. But the reality is, while there's always room for improvement, there is no question, and it's not close, that our elections are more secure, transparent, and verifiable than they've ever been. And that's certainly, you started by talking about 20 years ago, when we look at like Florida 2000, when our states had some vagueness about voter intent with the chads and everything.
Hanging chads.
Hanging chads, dimpled chads, dangling chads, right? And those machines are gone. And now what we've also seen is a professionalization of the election administration process. The people running elections now are simply incredibly good at what they do. And it doesn't matter whether they're conservative Republicans or liberal Democrats or something in between. And that is one of the reasons that somehow our election officials managed the highest turnout in American history, 20 million more ballots than we've ever seen in any election in the United States. And in the middle of a global pandemic, when they and their staffs were getting sick, and their work has now withstood 4 years of more scrutiny than any election in world history, and it has withstood that scrutiny. That's due to the professionalization of the men and women who run our elections all across this country.
So we've had 4 years of scrutiny, lawsuits and challenges to the election, and you were saying that not one of them has borne any fruit. But what are some fair critiques about our voting system? Like, we mentioned voter registration. What are some things that that are fair?
I think one of the things that we're still working towards, it's not really a critique, but it's an area where we're in the middle of the improvement, is there are lots of areas around our election procedures that we can make both more accessible for eligible voters and also reduce potential or perception for fraud. A great example is automatic voter registration. So for all the talk of removing voters from the lists, I think a lot of people also would say, why shouldn't it be even easier for eligible voters to get on the list with accurate information? And again, right now it's better than it's ever been. More voters have access to online voter registration, same-day registration, and automatic voter registration than ever before. But we can continue to improve that. And I think a model for this, and people might be surprised to hear this, is Georgia. Georgia does an absolutely great job with voter registration. They take advantage of every tool. They have automatic voter registration. So whenever a voter goes into a motor vehicles department in Georgia, that information is shared with elections immediately. And think about it. When you have a life event, where do you go? When you come of age, when you move, when you change names, you go to DMV. And that information is captured. Georgia has probably the highest voter registration rate in the country. We documented it at 98% of eligible voters in 2020, which is remarkable. And what's also remarkable is it appears that they have parity amongst race and other things. So I think if we could get to the point where we could find ways to both keep our lists more accurate, fight against the perception of fraud, but also make it easier for voters and make government work for them better, I think that's the next stage. But it requires that we have a conversation of both parties based on reality, not based on a fiction. You can't, for instance, there are advocates out there pushing for hand counts of ballots, which is a recipe for inaccurate, wrong, disaster in election processes.
So you mentioned that, we need sort of both parties to be sane. And this has become a very hotly politicized issue, from voter registration, Republican versus Democrat, to gerrymandering, which has become sort of a de rigueur practice. The Republicans gerrymandering the counties and the Democrats gerrymandering the cities, to the point where now most cities are blue and all counties are red, which we can get into. But I wanted to say, you mentioned Georgia, and I'm going to segue into a different topic. Georgia, Arizona, Hawaii, we have these issues where it's days, weeks, months before we can get the right amount. And a lot is always brought up. Like, for example, India, is a much larger democracy, and they can turn theirs around. Or a lot of these countries, most, democracies have an election night, and that's what it is. It's an election night, we know, within 24 hours. And we seem to have this ongoing news cycle of what the hell's going to happen in Arizona, and, what's going to happen in this county, and what's going to happen in Georgia. And, oh, my God, there's a thing. Why? Why does it take so long? And why is there this sort of ongoing, oh, my God, what is it, Maricopa County?
Yeah. Well, so this is a great question, because there's a misconception about how our elections work and how long it takes us to count ballots and why that is. But first, let me address the international comparisons, because we hear these a lot. Mm-hmm. First of all, you hear things about India, which doesn't have paper ballots, by the way, France, Argentina. Why can't we be like these countries? And the fact is, when these countries and almost every other country in the world has a major election, there is literally one race on that ballot. And in fact, in France, for instance, different colors of pieces of paper. So, and they're run by a centralized election authority in that country. We don't have that in this country. We don't have, even the states aren't centralized election authorities. We have nearly 10,000 little elections running all over the country. And in those elections, we have ballots that are incredibly long and complicated. For listeners in California, for instance, they know what I'm talking about. They know when they get that
Prop 37, Prop 85.
The voter information pamphlets, like a phone book, right? Yeah. For those people that know what phone books look like. In Arizona, they have 79 races in Maricopa County on their ballot. That is not the same as counting one race, and that takes longer. And that's exacerbated by the fact that we have all these different jurisdictions. Now, there's a good side to that too. It makes it very hard to hack into our elections, because there's no central authority you can hack into. We are decentralized. It's really hard. There are different equipment in different counties in some states, so it's really hard to do that. But that's why it's reasonable that our elections have always taken days and weeks to count. There's a reason this is enshrined in the Constitution, that the electors don't meet until 6 weeks after the election. There's a reason for that, dating back to 1789. That we have always taken days and weeks to count. And, the reason that we think some states go quicker is just because the margin's so large that the media will call races. People might think that California is getting counted faster than Georgia, but the reality is California will have counted far fewer of its ballots on election night than Georgia will have. It's just the margin will be so large and the exit polls so clear that the media will be able to say, when the polls close at 8 o'clock Pacific time on election night, we'll know who won California in all likelihood. Georgia's going to take more counts. And I use an analogy just to give an example. Imagine a big fishbowl full of red and blue jelly beans. Mm-hmm. If 90% of that jelly bowl is red, that fishbowl of jelly beans is red, you probably don't need to even start counting to know that red wins. If it's 70 or 60%, you probably need to count some of it to confirm that red, in fact, has more in that fishbowl. But if it's 50.1% blue and 49.9% red, you're going to count that whole bowl of jelly beans.
Right.
And that's going to take you longer. And in fact, you might want to go back if it's one jelly bean difference. You might want to go back and recount it just to make sure you got it right. And that's what the swing states are dealing with. They have no control over the margin, but that's why we all have to be patient, understanding that our neighbors, our members of our community are working probably 24/7 to count those ballots, and they always have. It's just the margins are really narrow.
So basically, you're saying, like, look, it's a complicated process. It's a long process, but that process is around and enshrined by the Constitution to make sure that it's secure, which by and large, by a 99% margin or whatever the margin is, by and large, it is secure. And
yeah, and by the way, if it's really close, there are legal challenges that can be brought. Florida 2000, right? If it's a few hundred votes, I expect it to be litigated.
Yeah.
I mean, that's appropriate. But 10,000 votes in an election law world, that's a
well, ex-President Trump said on the Joe Rogan podcast that it was a few thousand votes, and what's the truth of the 2020 election? Like, obviously they say that it was stolen. He keeps saying it was stolen. What's the truth there, and by how many votes? And has there been any evidence that it was stolen?
Yeah, so I literally wrote a book about this with Major Garrett from that's called The Big Truth, which is in my background there. It's fuzzy, but it's the truth is the 2020 presidential election was the largest margin of victory for any candidate in the 21st century when Barack Obama wasn't on the ballot. Mm-hmm. It was confirmed and verified by 60 plus courts. There is still not a shred of evidence that documents any problem that could have changed the outcome. And there is never, just to put people to have them have a perspective about this. When you see after all of the ballots have been counted unofficially or certified, and a candidate is behind by even 1,000 votes or more, that election is decided. I mean, there has never been an election in U.S. history, statewide election, that I know of, where a margin of more than 1,000 votes has ever been overcome in a recount or a legal challenge. It's just incredibly hard. There's too much documentary evidence. The candidate who's behind has to bring evidence to court to show that they can make up the margins. So 1,000 vote margin is effectively a landslide in an election contest. 10,000 is not close. It just means the state's narrowly divided, but we know who won definitively.
And so you've talked about the integrity of American elections and how it's at an all-time high, which is good news. You wouldn't believe that to listen to, a lot of the media, social media, or the GOP, for that matter. Why is that?
God, I wish I could tell you, Shane.
Tell me.
I mean, I think, the degree to which many political leaders in the Republican Party know that Donald Trump lost, know that he then incited an insurrection, and refused to take leadership is deeply troubling. There's a class of individuals who are grifters who have made a profit off of selling these lies for a long time and continue to. But I prefer to focus on the people who have been revealed to be, quite frankly, patriots and heroes, who have paid a political price in some cases, who've demonstrated political courage, who have never wavered, many of whom are still very, very strong conservatives who voted for Donald Trump in 2020, who have continued to tell the truth to their voters. People like Liz Cheney, people like Vice President Pence, people like Secretary of State Raffensperger in Georgia and his staff, people like Stephen Richer, the Maricopa County Recorder, and Bill Gates and Jack Sellers and Clint Hickman and others, Tom Galvin on the Maricopa County Board. These are all Republicans,
right?
Have not been willing to lie to their own voters and who put country first. And I've seen these people all over the country. There are others, federal judges. There's a report called Lost Not Stolen that I really recommend to everybody, lostnotstolen.org, written by former federal court judges appointed by George W. Bush and other Republicans, authored by Ted Olson, the Bush Solicitor General. It's actually, I don't know if he was Solicitor General under Bush, but he was Solicitor General under a Republican.
Right.
Who looked at all of these claims and said, no, there's nothing to them. There's no evidence of fraud. Biden just won the election. And unfortunately, their voices have been somewhat lonely. And I'm hoping we're getting into a psychological question. Maybe you can get a psychologist on to answer this.
But hold on, if you have the people who are actually responsible for these contested counties or contested states, you have these people who, in many cases, are Republicans saying, yeah, it's just not true. How has this maintained such a preeminent place in our political narrative for 4 years?
I suspect one of the factors is that so many of us as Americans have siloed ourselves off in these media bubbles when we only hear things that we like to hear. And I try not to do that. I try to listen to news and commentary from across the perspective. But there are people who have never heard the fact that 2020 had much more verifiable paper ballots than 2016, who've never heard the fact that actually Donald Trump did a lot better in Philadelphia and Detroit and other cities in 2020 than he did in 2016. Where he lost was the suburbs, who have never heard the fact that a majority of states with large numbers of mail ballots were won by Trump in 2016 and 2020. These are the kinds of things that people, and when I say them to people who don't believe the election was legit, you can tell they're actually having a hard time processing. And I'll tell you a very quick story. I hosted a focus group of people with serious doubts about the election in Arizona back in 2020, early 2023, with Major Garrett and Brad Raffensperger and Bill Gates from Maricopa County and Frank Luntz. And I give these people a ton of credit. They were challenged in their beliefs. And one of them said at one point, I really like politicians who say what they're going to do, which is why I like my particular congressperson. And I won't say who that was. But I said, well, let me ask you a question. Do you believe that congressperson was legitimately elected? And you could see him almost retreat and try to figure out a way that he could process this. And he said something that absolutely terrified me. He didn't say, oh, there was an algorithm and it changed who, he said, well, maybe nobody is ever truly elected.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, my God, what have we done to ourselves that even the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist Party couldn't have dreamed of achieving?
Therein lies the rub. And now we've gotten into the macro. You've given us a lot of the micro, which I thank you for, which actually makes me feel a little bit better that, look, we have secure voting, we have secure machines, the voting fraud is de minimis, we're letting immigrants in that are voting is a myth, which, by the way, a lot of people are going to freak out. I can picture the comments now. These are facts. These are facts. These are facts that are verified by courts, that are verified by machines, that are verified by overseeing bodies. These are facts, nonpartisan facts, in many cases GOP facts. But let's get into the macro. We've destroyed the integrity or the perception of integrity of our electoral process, even though it's never been stronger, because it's a narrative that people want to believe. They don't want their side to lose. And now it could be Democratic, it could be Republican. It's been Republican, more so Republican, but you can now, the Democrats can now use that tool, right? That, oh, it was gerrymandered, or oh, it was this, or Elon Musk is friends with Trump, or Google did this, or what have you. You can come up with whatever the hell you want. So, what are the macro ramifications of losing trust in the electoral process in the great democratic experiment that is America?
Yeah, this is such an important question. I mean, right now we're in a position where likely a majority of the Republican primary electorate, if not a majority of Republicans, believes the lie about our elections. Democrats don't right now because they won the most recent elections. In 2016, I was one of the first to come out and say, this election is legitimate. Donald Trump legitimately won by the rules. You don't have to like the Electoral College, but Secretary Clinton knew the Electoral College existed. She knew what the rules were when we went to the election. And she conceded, right. And there were some isolated members of the Democratic Party who tried to object, but that was not an organized effort by Secretary Clinton or by the Democratic Party. I actually have a limited series podcast that I have out called The Count with David Becker, and I hope people will listen to it. But I address this particular issue, which is what happens if, as is very possible, Donald Trump could legitimately win this election. And if he does, I will be out there saying he legitimately won this election. And what happens if Democrats, probably not organized by the campaign, I don't expect to see this organized by Vice President Harris, but what happens if some Democrats on a more isolated basis seek to engage in some of the same election denial, seek to stop certifications?
What's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Right. And if we live in a country where a majority of both parties don't believe they can ever lose and refuse to accept defeat when they do lose, especially in a closely divided country, we're doomed. We're doomed as a democracy. And right now, what we're seeing, particularly on the Republican side, is an effort to create a false myth around the inevitability of the election of their candidate. For those in those silos and their bubbles, they're hearing messages that say there's no way Donald Trump can lose. They're spending more of their resources on that than actually winning. And so what this is going to do is create this expectation that will result in this incredible shock if he happens to lose. And you can imagine how grifters and losing candidates could leverage that shock and quickly transform it into anger and potentially violence.
Yes. And so, we were looking at this, we're going to do a future podcast on, but the $24 Big Macs, which was pushed by the CCP because it was seen as taking a lot of, it was viral and it was taking hold because it's a little story that shows the inflationary problems in the United States, and people are, oh my God, it's a $24 Big Mac. Oh my God. Oh my God. And McDonald's even came out and said, what the hell are you talking about? There's no $24 fucking Big Macs. And they got angry and they were looking for someone to sue. And then it came out, okay, well, it's mostly coming from the CCP, Chinese Communist Party. Now, we have no one to blame but ourselves for this one. It seems. But however, if you're the CCP or the Russians or the Syrians or the Iranians or the North Koreans, this is like a gift from God where we're saying, okay, we're going to call into question the whole electoral process in America, and only if our guy wins does it. And look, I have no dog in the race. I'm non-political. I'm centrist. I love the political process. I love the game. I love the story. But none of this exists without electoral integrity. And this is why it's such an important topic. And thank you for being with us today to get into this, which is, on the one hand, the best news ever, which is it's never been more secure. It's never been better. It's never, like, the amount of fraud is de minimis. The machines are such that, it makes it incredibly difficult to hack into them. I actually brought up this story with you that Vice hacked into an election machine from the 2016 election. And then you quickly, but they're not on a system and they're not on the thing, and you can't hack into them. They're their own, and the way that they're stored. And we can get into how secure they are to go back to the micro. But in the macro, we've never been more secure. But the perception it's never been more insecure, that there's voter fraud that's rampant, that we're letting immigrants in just so that they can vote for Democratic cities. We're at the sort of mercy of these foreign malignant actors who can come in and say whatever the hell they want about the election. Where does it go? Now, this is a big macro question, but where does it go after this election? And where does it go if if Harris wins And where does it go if Trump wins?
So it's I appreciate your confidence in me that you think I can actually maybe tell you this. I'm going to do my best. First of all, you hit on some point that's, I think, really important, which is, if you look at our adversaries overseas, especially Russia, we know, and the intelligence community has confirmed, Russia is intervening on the side of Trump right now.
Yeah.
To some degree, perhaps a lesser degree, Iran is intervening on the side of Harris right now.
Really? Interesting.
Perhaps that's one of the things they just reported out.
Very interesting.
China appears to just be a chaos agent right now.
Right.
But once the election happens and it's over, all of our adversaries will transform into chaos agents.
Yeah.
Russia, even if Trump wins, I think it's highly likely Russia, even though they'll be happy Trump won, Russia will start targeting disinformation at Harris supporters that the election was stolen. They want us divided. They want us hating each other. They want us to think that there is a conspiracy of millions of Americans, by the way, half of them Republicans and half of them Democrats, who have somehow conspired to steal an election over 10,000 jurisdictions, and somehow there's not a single shred of evidence and no one is talking about it. It really defies, belief. But they want us to believe it, and they've been remarkably successful in that thanks to their domestic allies here. What happens after the election, I think it's going to come down to leadership, regardless of who wins. I think what's been lacking, despite the fact that I mentioned people like Vice President Pence and people like Secretary Raffensperger in Georgia, are more people coming out and saying enough of this. We are going to accept the results of elections. We are going to enforce that on members of our own party. And by the way, if the Democrats start going down this path, doing the same, and hold the parties to start holding their members accountable for this. Right now, the inmates are running the asylum, and we've got to get beyond that. And the fact that we haven't seen as much leadership as we might otherwise like is deeply disturbing. And I think we're going to get. One of the things that really troubles me and worries me is the fact that the Supreme Court has given, while I uphold the institution, I'm not a Supreme Court basher, but the immunity decision that the Supreme Court had this summer is unfortunately a roadmap to corruption that I think a future Trump administration or perhaps some other future corrupt administration just can follow with complete impunity.
What do you mean by that? What's their decision, and what did it?
So the decision basically said anything within the core responsibilities of the presidency and within his official duties, the president is immune for.
Yeah, right.
And within that, you can't even look at the intent of the president to see whether he intended or he or she intended to break laws. So imagine if instead of what we saw in 2020, instead of him bringing in Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell and people from outside the government to aid him in his effort to subvert the election, now he just has to make sure he's only talking to White House counsel, only talking to Department of Justice. He can only, because those are within his core responsibilities to oversee the executive branch. And so there is a clear roadmap here that we have to be very worried about. And so when people make their decisions, they're going to have to be careful to elect candidates of character who are going to honor the office rather than use it to commit crimes.
Yeah, one of the reasons why we wanted to do this podcast was because a lot of social media, a lot of memes are where people are getting their news, and then they become accepted as givens, and then it becomes policy. And we have no further to look than the presidential debates where ex-President Trump said, they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs, and in Ohio, and then they called in Ohio, and there's been no cases, et cetera, and then now there's people, well, of course they are, and it goes back and forth. And you mentioned intent, and I think that's important because what I want to get to is, does the Harris camp, and more importantly, the Trump camp, know? Because President Trump, ex-President Trump, obviously watches social media because he's bringing it up in his debates, and this is the dogs and cats reference. Does he know that our elections have never been more secure, that voter fraud is basically non-existent, and that that these like you said, like 1,000 is a landslide in the sense that you're not going to, you're not going to recount them and it be, there's 1,000 on the other side now. There's the differential. So do they know that it's safe and solid? Or are they getting information from social media saying the election's bullshit and it came down to these 17 counties and it's a handful of votes? Because he brought up a bunch of stuff on the Rogan podcast that was sort of nonsensical, but he obviously someone's told him something that he believes or is citing some sort of factual evidence for.
Right. I get this question a lot. My stock answer is I don't live inside the mind of Donald Trump. I don't know what he actually knows or not.
Right.
I can tell
his
you
camp.
I can tell you what the facts show.
Yeah.
That in 2020, Donald Trump was told by his attorney general, by his Department of Justice, by his Department of Defense, by his Department of Homeland Security, by his own White House counsel, by members of his own campaign, and by members of his own family that he had lost. The question is, did he believe all of those people and know he hadn't lost? There's certainly evidence that he might have said things that indicate he did. Or is he so detached from reality that he holds on to these delusions? I think both are somewhat.
Or are there people? So when something happens, did I win the fight or did I lose the fight? And there's 80% of the people say, "Well, you lost the fight, Shane." But then your echo chamber says, maybe you have two black eyes, but he has a chip too. So you kind of
But at some point, you have to say, how hard am I looking for someone to agree with me that I'm going to Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell, who he himself indicated what he thought of Sidney Powell. When my family is telling me that I lost. And I'll also tell you, as we're looking forward, looking into the more recent past, if you look at some of his supporters like Elon Musk, there have been so many attempts in good faith to engage and say, hey, when you said this is why Democrats oppose paper ballots, we don't know what you're talking about because every place almost has paper ballots and the only place that don't are Republican areas. Every time people in good faith have tried to engage with them, there's been no engagement. And so I think at some point, certainly in reality, and certainly from the perspective of a prosecutor trying to prove intent, and I'm a former Justice Department attorney myself, you can impute intent through a lot of facts, and there's a lot of facts here. I think Jack Smith's indictments of the former president certainly lay out a very strong case for intentional interference with the election.
So two final things. I can already hear the waves of people calling into question our logical and very sane podcast. And again, I want to thank you for spending time with us today. And I want to open the corridors to have a follow-up, because either this is going to come out on, during, or just after the election. And this is how prescient we are and how sad the situation is simultaneously, that we know it's going to be chaos. And so we're already doing this podcast, and I would highly recommend that people listen to David Becker and look him up, because we need sanity. We need to know the facts before we all go crazy, and we need to know who's trying to manipulate misinformation and disinformation and why. What do you have to say to the people who are going to say, well, you're bought and paid for by the Democrats and you're obviously speaking for the deep state and you're part of the problem and et cetera, et cetera?
These are the same people, by the way, who claim Brad Raffensperger and Liz Cheney and Vice President Pence are rhinos, Republicans in name only, right? I mean, it is... Here are the facts. I've worked with both parties my whole career. My major case at the Department of Justice was against the Democrats in Georgia. I received a commendation of merit from the George W. Bush administration while I was at the Department of Justice. I work with as closely with Secretary Raffensperger in Georgia as I do with Secretary Benson in Michigan and all over the place. And in 2016, I was one of the first to acknowledge the truth that Donald Trump won legitimately. And if you're listening to this after the election and Donald Trump has won, I will be one of the people who's out there telling you that Donald Trump won, and I'll be one of the people highly criticizing anyone who opposes Donald Trump, trying to delegitimize his victory. That's what I can tell you. I'm also not going to shy away from the facts, and the facts are the former president has very destructively delegitimized our democracy for a long time. And something that affects me a great deal and makes me personally offended is he has targeted by state, by county, and even individually, the public servants who run our elections. They have dealt with threats and harassment for over 4 years now. I run the Election Official Legal Defense Network, where we as a nonprofit recruit a network of attorneys who are willing to serve pro bono to advise and assist election officials. That's the reality now. I'm very proud that we offer that. Our country should not be in a place where a nonprofit has to offer legal advice and assistance pro bono to public servants like election officials.
Yeah, why would you do it if you know you're going to get sued? It's crazy.
I mean, these people are some of the most dedicated public servants you will ever meet. And I encourage you, please go vote. Go thank your poll workers in your polling place. If you happen to meet your local election official, thank them for their service. They don't show up on Monday to put on an election. They're working 24/7 in most cases for the months before the election and after the election. So I can just continue to lay out the facts. I'm going to call it like it is.
Great.
And I appreciate you saying all the nice things you did, because we need sanity.
Yes, great point to leave on. We need sanity. Democracy, it's not pretty, but it sure as hell beats the alternative. On the good side of things, which I'm very happy about, and I didn't know all of this, so I'm very happy that I asked you questions. Education. This is going to be my Trumpian weave to education, but we have secure and safe elections. All of these claims of voter fraud and immigration and election hacking and all this stuff, which by the way, I didn't know, so I was sort of affected by this continual wave of it. So I'm very happy to hear all this stuff. Although I'm also nervous because it seems like the rhetoric is flying in face of the facts, which we have to educate ourselves with the facts. See, there it came back to education. We have to educate ourselves, and I encourage everyone to educate yourself on the facts. Look up David Becker, read his books. Fantastic discussion today. I want to leave the channel open because I know on either side, and I'm hoping I'm proved wrong. But if this becomes a hanging Chad situation, I would love to talk to you again, because on the good side of things, I feel much more calm about the chaos of the election process, but more afraid than ever about the political rhetoric and the political instability caused by this issue.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. I'll just say one last thing to end on that's slightly optimistic, I hope.
There we go.
There will be attempts to create an impression of chaos where it doesn't exist. Tens of millions of people have voted already. They voted safely. There have been hardly any lines. It's been secure. That's going to continue all the way through Election Day. But more importantly, I know people are concerned that a losing candidate might try to find some secret path to steal power. That is not going to happen.
Right.
Whoever the legitimate winner of this election is, even if they incite violence, the winner of the election will have their hand on the Bible on January 20th. And I am just absolutely confident of that. And I hope everyone can feel confident in that. It might not be the winner you wanted.
Right.
But that person will take their oath of office.
It will be the legitimate winner. And who we don't want to have win this election are the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, or the Iranians. Thank you, right, David, for your time. Very interesting. And hopefully we get back together to chop it up and on a much lighter note than walking into this election with trepidation.
I love that, Shane. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you.